So this next presentation is interesting. First of all, we have Ashly Stone. And Ashly Stone is the founder and host of the Comeback Podcast, a platform dedicated to sharing inspiring stories of individuals who return to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. For over 3 years, Ashly's been amplifying the voices of faith, redemption, and personal transformation, creating a safe and uplifting space for people navigating their own spiritual journeys. There's a lot more you can read about it here. We're going to turn the time over to her to essentially do one of her podcast episodes here with Dawn Bradley. So with that, I turn the time over to Ashly and Dawn.
So if you are a listener of the podcast, you know that I always start out the podcast and say, Dawn, oh my gosh, I am so excited to have you on the Comeback Podcast. But really, this is absolutely such a treat for me because we've actually had Dawn on the podcast, and it truly was one of the most impactful episodes for listeners and also for me personally. I have sent your episode to everybody I know. And I think that there are so many incredible spiritual connections and dots that you connect that have brought you back. And it is just such an honor for me to be here with you today and interview you for the second time. I'm so excited.
Thank you. I'm excited too.
Yes, awesome. Well, let's go ahead and start from the beginning. Let's start, from the beginning of your story.
Okay. And so with my story, sometimes I don't know where to begin or how much to include because my faith journey is very complex. Right? It started early. So I was raised by wonderful parents, Ed and Patricia Bradley, who were converts to the church. And when I was about 15, I had a sort of spiritual awakening. I became very devout. And that led me to really delve first into the scriptures and then into the history of the church, because our faith really is intertwined a great deal with history, right? First of all, because we're Christians, and so it matters whether it matters that there was a Christ, right? And it matters, his resurrection matters as a historical event. And then the restoration itself, right? The events there, the first vision, the priesthood restoration events, the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. And so I started studying the early history of the restoration with the idea that this was sacred history, that I could learn things from it that would be relevant to me in my spiritual life. I looked at Joseph Smith and I saw that, if you look at the other authors of Scripture, right, most of them in the Bible, they write some little tiny book, right? That's how much revelation we have recorded through them. The books attributed to Moses, well, let's see, Isaiah is a much bigger chunk. The books attributed to Moses, definitely a big chunk. But the revelation through Joseph Smith, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants revelations through Paul Great Price, it's huge, right? And so I thought, well, if I want to understand personal revelation, I should look at this Joseph Smith guy. He evidently knew what he was doing, right? And so I wanted to learn from him. But as I went into my studies, I got hit pretty early on with things that I didn't expect. And so one of the moments is it actually came through a family home evening. I was 17. We went to Deseret Book that was then in the University Mall, and my dad said, "I'll buy you any church book that you want." Right? And there, in the Journal Authority section, between the books by Boyd K. Packer and those by Joseph Fielding Smith, was one by B.H. Roberts, who had been a prolific church author and a Journal Authority several decades earlier. And there was a new book, even though he'd been deceased for over half a century, there was a new book out from him called Studies of the Book of Mormon. And what I didn't know is that this book wasn't trying to express things that he believed. It was sort of his devil's advocate case in the 1930s or so against the Book of Mormon, where he was trying to anticipate arguments that critics might make in the future And, he was raising those arguments so we could figure out how to combat the arguments. And at the time, I didn't know the answers to the different sorts of questions that he was raising. And so it was the first time that I really experienced doubt. And it really was a really shaking experience for a 17-year-old. I held on in spite of a lot of doubt. And I ended up, feeling more secure with my faith, going on a mission, and so on. Came back, went to BYU, and resumed my study in church history and scripture. And I started to find that something that I like to explain to people is that, like, when you're reading a book from someone on, let's say, if you're reading any book that has intellectual content, scholarship, or something like that, someone has taken the effort to process through everything to integrate it intellectually. If you're reading something that has spiritual content, they've also taken the effort to integrate things, process it, and integrate it spiritually. But if you are doing your own research, particularly in, let's say, the history of the church, then the full burden of integrating everything, processing and integrating, it falls on you. And so this was the case for me. And I was making new discoveries in the history of the church, and it fell on me to make sense of them, both intellectually and spiritually. Joseph Smith used this quote from the poet Alexander Pope, where he said, "A little knowledge is a dangerous thing," right? And I started making discoveries. They were genuine new discoveries in the history of the church. Some of them were really exciting. But they weren't like a big picture of things. They were just discoveries about this incident in church history or that incident. And as I started piling up these new discoveries, what I started to find is that the picture of church history as I had been taught it, and the picture of church history as I was seeing it increasingly with these new discoveries, they were diverging. They were going two different directions. And at first, I handled that pretty well, and with time, I didn't. There was this increasing kind of dissonance inside of me because I had new discoveries, but I didn't have a big new picture to put them in, to make full sense of them. And so gradually, at first, without even realizing it, I started losing my faith. And I was very sincere. I was completely sincere in my quest for truth. But along the way, I also was kind of letting go of some of the more practical spiritual aspects of my life during some of this research, right? And so I didn't have that to kind of serve as an anchor. And so I ended up, after several years of this research, just not believing anymore, right? I didn't believe that Joseph Smith was a prophet. And at first, I still believed in Christ, that he was God's son, and then that kind of fell apart because I was applying the same sorts of skepticism to the Bible that I did to, the history of the church. And then I started questioning God, and this had to do, to a great extent, really with the problem of evil and suffering, particularly the suffering of children. And also, I became aware of how deeply mental illness could affect people. I saw people in the world around me just who it seemed like they were affected to such a core level by this, and I just couldn't see the goodness in this, the justice. And so I lost my faith completely. I was an atheist, and I thought to myself, like, there's no room for an atheist in the church. Someday I'm going to publish these things that I'm finding the way I was seeing them at the time. And they're not going to want me in the church anyway, so I should just go ahead. Maybe they'll kick me out, and so I should just go ahead and remove myself. So I put in a letter to have my name removed from the church records. And when I first put in the letter, I felt like a sense of liberation, wow, I'm doing this, And then when I got a letter back saying that I was no longer a member of the church, I felt very different. I felt like I'd been kind of cut off from the only real community that I had ever known. And I thought, whatever else I understood at 8 years old about baptism, I understood that I was trying to, be like this Jesus and do good things. Why would I undo this? But I thought, well, it's too late now because, you can lose your faith and stay in the church, but if you want to join or rejoin the church, they want you to believe. And so I thought, I can't do that. And so I thought I was out permanently. And so I went, I entered into my own sort of what I call like a personal kind of wandering in the wilderness at that point.
Did you join any community to replace your church community?
I did. I tried different things. I very much had a desire for community, and I had a desire for meaning and spirituality. That was inherent to who I was, who I am. That was partly, sorry, let me get emotional. My mother, Patricia Bradley, she's passed away now. She was always a person of just such depth, a thinker, and so deep emotionally and spiritually. She really, I think, instilled in me spirituality from the time I was young and just a search for meaning. So ever since, I remember thinking at 11 years old about my own mortality and wondering what I would do with my life and about my legacy and thinking about having children. And then I remember at 15 really thinking about what's the ultimate meaning behind everything, like what's the meaning behind the things that are meaningful in our lives, ultimately, and so on. And so losing the meaning, the ultimate meaning in my life was a big blow to me. And I started to, at first, I was going to just like ex-Mormon social events. There was a promise of community there. And I definitely made friends there. It was, and there was then, and there is even more now, a thriving ex-Mormon community along the Wasatch Front. Right? And something that I came to discover is that it was friend groups. What was a community? The way that the church is a community where people really like have each other's backs, and there are these like enduring bonds that are built. It's like a family. Right? And as I continued the journey, my search for community intertwined with my search for spirituality. I was reading in something called Skeptic Magazine, which is basically just what it sounds like. And it's part of the skeptic movement that questions whether there's anything supernatural. Right? And it's run by a guy named Michael Shermer. And I was reading in it one day, and there was an ad for a book called Biocosm that was endorsed actually by the editor of this Skeptic magazine, Michael Shermer, so I knew it couldn't be religious or supernatural. And it claimed to show, without any appeal to the supernatural, that there was some ultimate meaning behind the universe. And I was like, this sounds like a book for me. And so I went and I checked it out from the University of Utah Library, read it, and the first part of it laid out what's called the problem of the fine-tuning of the universe for the existence of life. And so this is basically the idea that like if gravity were like 1/10,000,000th part stronger or something like that, the matter in the early universe would have collapsed into black holes and we wouldn't be here, there wouldn't be life. And if, gravity had been that much weaker, like the matter would have dispersed very quickly and there wouldn't be galaxies, and again, there wouldn't be life, we wouldn't be here. But it's this way for all different laws of nature, not just for gravity. And so the chances of us being here, like one noted scientist had concluded, are 1 in 10 to the 200th power. Anybody who claims to know what that number means is lying, because we can't even understand 1 in a billion. That's 10 to the 9th, 10 to the 200th power. It's just ridiculously large. And so the author showed that most of the common explanations for this fine-tuning of the universe for the existence of life don't work. And I was like, okay, then what's the answer? And his answer ended up being that our distant descendants will engineer the universe so that when it collapses, it rebounds in such a way that there can be life. And so the universe is as it is now because of things that will happen in the far future. And I'm like, what is he talking about? He thinks this is more likely than God, And I thought, I haven't thought that there was a God, but I think God's more likely than this, And so that started me wondering again, why is the universe, all kinds of things, why, sort of questions I had suppressed for a while in my own mind. Why does the universe make sense? Why is it rational? Why do we have things like consciousness? Why do we have reason that points us to truth? Why do we have like a moral sense? How do we make sense of moral truth?
Also, you were you had a lot of spiritual depth when you were younger, it sounds like. How did you justify those spiritual experiences being an atheist?
So that's a good question. And so what I didn't deny that I had experiences. I had just come to think that they came from me. They came from my own mind. I thought, the mind's like a powerful thing. These are personally meaningful experiences, but they're just from inside of me. Now, there was a particular experience where it was harder to explain it that way, but I had come to question even that one, and that was when I was doing my archival research at the church archives when I was 18. One time I was headed home. We lived at the top of the avenues in Salt Lake City. I was walking to the bus stop. There was a crosswalk on State Street. It's not there now. There's a median there now. But I was stepping off the curb to go into this crosswalk, and I had this thought come into my mind: don't go out in front of that car. There was a car that had just rounded the corner off of South Temple. I was turning, and I thought, okay, well, I'm not supposed to go out in front of it. So I did walk out onto the street. I just didn't go into its lane. And so I was a couple feet away from that car's lane. And as it passed in front of me, I noticed that both the driver and the front seat passenger, they were hunched over, right, like this. They were, somebody spilled his big gulp or something on the floor, and they were trying to clean up. Something was going on in that car, right? But the question is, would I have been able to know this, right? Why did I have this warning in my mind? And for years that had convinced me that there'd been divine intervention. But then I'd come to question it because I thought, well, it's not like this happens for everybody. Am I supposed to think I'm special or something? I'm not going to think I'm special or whatever, So I thought maybe somehow this came from some unconscious perception on my part or whatever. So when I had come to believe in God again, I happened to be living in Salt Lake again and was working out of the family history library doing estate research. I was walking, as I would walk to work, I would walk right past the spot where this miraculous event had happened. I started going to the spot and looking and thinking, okay, well, that car turned here. I was faced this way. What would I have been able to perceive or not perceive? And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, there's no way I could have known what happened and tipped myself off about this. This came from outside of me. So I owe my life to something larger than me, right, that cares. God doesn't just exist behind the universe. God cares. And so then I thought, well, what do I do then? What does God want me to do? How does God want me to live my life? I actually, for a while, one of the faiths that I studied that really impressed me is the Baha'i faith. I don't know if I mentioned that before when we talked, but so it's a really expansive faith. They believe kind of like some things that Joseph Smith said in Nauvoo about receiving truth, let it come from where it may. They believe that all of the founders of the major faiths in the world were inspired by God, were sent by God, and so on. And so I thought this is a beautiful, faith here, very expansive. And so I kind of latched onto that. And then I was happy with that, but something terrible happened. I had my youngest brother, Charles, was 25, and he died very suddenly. I talked with him. I saw him. We talked the night before he died, and the next day he was gone. And that made me think a lot more about life after death, because I thought there was something, but my ideas were really vague, really vague. And at his viewing, it was at that time the saddest thing I've ever seen. Unfortunately, it's not now. But I looked at his body laid out there, and I thought, this is the last time I'm going to see my brother, because I thought that if we had some afterlife, it was very immaterial, and I said my idea was really vague. And so I started really wondering about the resurrection. Again, I'd been taught about, right, Christ's resurrection, and was that something that was real? Was that something true? A friend got for me as a gift this giant book called The Resurrection of the Son of God by the biblical scholar and Anglican priest N.T. Wright. And I read through it, and he argues powerfully that the early Christians would not have believed, the disciples would not have believed that Jesus was risen unless they both saw him and the tomb was actually empty, like it says in the Gospels. And for someone for let's say an atheist, maybe that evidence wouldn't be compelling, but if you already have reason to believe that there's a God and that God intervenes, then the possibility that God intervened here, right, with Christ goes way up, right? And not only that, but this wasn't just some random guy from the ancient world. This isn't a story that, Julius Caesar was raised from the dead or, something like that. Look at what this man taught. Look at, who he was and the beauty of his message, and that of all people in the ancient world, the one where we have this strong testimony that he was raised from the dead was this man. Right? And so one night, I was actually working late. I was at the Family History Library, and I didn't work for the library, but I did research out of the library. I went into one of the little side rooms. I'd been thinking about all this, and one of the little classrooms there, and I knelt down, and I just opened my heart to God, right? And I recognized that God had revealed himself to me, and his son had reached out to me. God wanted a relationship with me. And I embraced Christ. And on my way walking home that night, I felt like just waves of peace coming over me, like this palpable presence of peace. And I started trying to grow closer to Christ again, reading the New Testament. I even started reading the Book of Mormon. I thought that the Book of Mormon, I'd come to believe, I forgot a big thing, a giant thing. I had come to think Joseph Smith was a scoundrel, right? Like he was an opportunist.
And you considered yourself to be a Joseph Smithologist. Like you had done a lot of research on Joseph Smith.
I hadn't come up with that term yet, but yes. He's been the central focus of my research for a long time. Like, so I started when I was 17. I ain't 17 anymore, right? It's been a long journey, right? I've spent literally tens and tens of thousands of hours trying to understand Joseph Smith, right? And I was still in the thick of that while I was outside of the church. My curiosity, my fascination continued with him, right? But I had gone from really having him on a hero status for me to thinking that, well, he had made all this up. But I recognized that there was power in the Book of Mormon that had really earlier in my life helped me feel close to Christ. And so I thought maybe I'll try reading it more. I was so convinced that it was from Joseph Smith, and yet I felt closer to Christ as I read it. But then I thought, this is confusing. What am I doing? Like, it doesn't make sense for me to be reading this book for spiritual illumination when I think it's from this guy who was a scoundrel, and so I just sort of laid all that aside for a while. I was working on my master's in history, and I was doing a project on the first vision. I was also doing research on the lost 116 pages of the Book of Mormon that would later result in my book on that subject. I was thinking about First Vision, and I started noticing that there were sort of endowment elements in the First Vision, right? So I had thought that, and in the Book of Mormon, I had thought up to this point that Joseph Smith didn't know anything about the Nauvoo endowment until he became a Freemason in 1842. And, I was reading, I was thinking about First Vision. I was thinking about the story of the brother of Jared in the Book of Mormon, how he becomes a seer, right? And I noticed that, so the brother of Jared, he goes up on a mountaintop, and Joseph Smith had said later that mountaintops anciently served as temples where people received signs and tokens, endowment. And brother of Jared is up there, and he's speaking with the Lord through the veil, and the Lord puts his hand through the veil, and he asks the brother of Jared a series of questions to test his faith and knowledge, beginning with a question about his hand. And when the brother of Jared passes the test, he admits him into his presence, and he says, "You're redeemed from the fall," which evokes the whole backstory of Adam and Eve. And then he gives him these white stones, which are like Joseph Smith talked about in Revelation 2:17, says, "To him that overcometh, I will give unto him a white stone, in the which is written a new name, which no man knoweth, save him that receiveth it." And I thought about how the story doesn't reveal that this is happening. It doesn't reveal his name. It just calls him the brother of Jared. So there's like a theme of secret names and so on. And so there were these and other things that all were like.
Can we all just take a second and acknowledge how incredibly amazing what he just said is? Like mind-blowing.
Thank you.
Okay, sorry,
Well,
I just had to shout that out.
So thank you. My mind was completely blown. I was sitting in the library cafe of Utah State University, working on a paper, and I just was like, "What?" And it came with a series of other, like right within a matter of several minutes, all these connections it's stuff that I'd been working on for years, but suddenly the connections came. And that was the first time I had the thought, like, I think maybe I'm going back to the church, right? Now, it wasn't that simple. I still had a lot I needed to figure out, right? But that was the first time the thought came to me. And I realized that there was more here than I had been seeing, much more. And there were depths, right? And I ended up starting that process soon afterward of coming back to the church. It's a beautiful experience. The bishop had me take the missionary discussions, which was wild. Probably the funniest moment was the bishop didn't want the missionaries to know that I'd previously been a member of the church because he wanted them to not leave anything out. And so right as they were about to arrive for the first discussion, I realized that I had the bookcases in the hall with every conceivable book about Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon, and that was going to raise a lot of questions. And so I moved fast, right, moving all those books. So they arrived just, I was all sweaty, right, and they arrived, and I had just moved the last of those books out. It was just a couple months before I was rebaptized. It was a beautiful, beautiful experience. And I was welcomed back into the church wonderfully. How are we on time? What do we need?
We have 18 minutes.
18 minutes, okay. So it's been several years now that I've been back, and I had the privilege of spending a little time up at the Joseph Smith papers, working on the earliest Joseph Smith documents. Life has had, a lot of ups and downs since then, but I certainly have the gospel in my life as an anchor.
How you went from this place of putting Joseph Smith in hero status, and then you shifted that perception to, oh, he's an opportunist, just totally different view. Now, as you came back to the church, how did you reconcile some of those viewpoints of viewing him as an opportunist, and how did that change, and what does that look like today?
Sure. So one thing to realize, so when I did come back to the church, I had been very involved in the sort of ex-Mormon community. I'd gone to what was called the ex-Mormon conference sometimes. It was every year in October, right? And I had been really involved in message boards online, one of which was really dominated by ex-Mormons. I had friendships I'd made there over years. When I announced that I had come back to the church, I was very welcomed by some people, and I was really made kind of a pariah by other people, because now the way I was treated it was like I was an apostate from the apostates, kind of, right? It was sort of I was a meta apostate. You know? So, and they were calling me an apologist and all these things, which to them is a dirty word. And so but what they didn't understand was I was just still trying to figure things out. Like, I just want to know what happened. Right? And so I actually didn't leave behind any of the discoveries that I made while I was out of the church and come back to the church. It's not like I was like, oh, I'm just going to get rid of this data or these discoveries, hide those or whatever, No, what actually happened is that I came up with a larger framework. So when I mentioned earlier that when I was making sort of like smaller discoveries, but I hadn't discovered like a new framework to put them in, and that was the problem, right? With time, I did find more of a larger framework. And so the same sacred events were there, the first vision, the Joseph and Oliver Cowdery's experience with John the Baptist, Peter, James, and John, Moses, Elias, and Elijah, and Christ, and so on. But they were in larger contexts. In some ways, they had different meanings for me now, and so on. And so Joseph Smith was very, very human, and Joseph would say things in Nauvoo, sometimes in his sermons, like, I do not want you to think that I am, a very good man, like I'm a sinner and so on. And we all want to be like, no, you're almost perfect or whatever. That's not what he was saying, right? So we have an exemplar. That exemplar is Jesus Christ. Joseph Smith, just like others. I mean, there are people around us who have amazing strengths and gifts that we can benefit from, be inspired by, learn from. Joseph Smith is one of those people, right? And there are, I actually just did an episode with Stephen Jones that will be airing soon about Joseph Smith's childhood leg surgery and the sort of nobility of character that comes out from looking at the details of that experience and then looking at his later life. And so there are things there that we can absolutely be inspired by and benefit from, right? But also to recognize that when we put our faith in anyone except God and in God through Jesus Christ, they are going to let us down. We are going to be disappointed. They were never meant to be the objects of our faith. They were meant to point us to the object of our faith. So if our faith is in Joseph Smith, we are setting ourselves up to falter in our faith. Right? So Joseph Smith, I see him as very, very human, and he's pointing us to God, right? And we need to not confuse that and sort of infuse him with a kind of quasi-divinity that he didn't claim for himself, And so, so I can accept, Joseph Smith's humanness, just like I can accept my own and that of, the people around me. Since coming back to the church, it's not like, for me, it's not like life challenges have stopped, right? not even remotely. And in many ways, I have grown, and my knowledge has deepened. And I've also had just really, really difficult experiences. And this is very personal. This will be the first time this, is something that I'll be sharing publicly. I have 2 sons, and Delaney, I don't know if you were able to get those pictures, but if so, this would be the time. But my sons, Donnie, the older, and Nicholas. As it is for parents, right? They have been the 2 great lights of my life. Recently, unexpectedly, my older son, Donnie, whom some of you will remember because he came to the fair conference a couple times several years ago. Recently, Donnie died. And what an innocent heart. Just a tremendously open, beautiful heart, right? One time when they were little, I had tucked Donnie and Nikki in, as I usually did, and about 45 minutes later, I was sitting in the front room, and I heard the padding of little feet in the hall, and I went out into the hall to see who was still up, when they shouldn't be, and there was Donnie with tears streaming down his cheeks. I said, "Donnie, sweetheart, what's wrong?" And he looked up at me with those big, tearful eyes, and he said, "Dad, I'll miss you when you die." Donnie was about 7 at that time, and he just had he was such a deep thinker and feeler. He was already thinking about the fact that I was mortal, right? Someday we'd be apart. And he was a poet. He was in his 20s when he died. He was a poet. He was a philosopher. He was what's called a polymath. He was an expert in all different things. Just had boundless curiosity and a tremendous empathy. He said that he told his brother Nicholas months before he died that it made him sad to think that anyone in the world was sad. And I wondered, after I came to believe in God again, because remember that the reason I had stopped believing in God, the main reason was the problem of evil and suffering. And it was mostly the suffering of children. It was also recognizing the harm that mental illness does. Donnie struggled. He suffered pain from mental illness as well as physical illness. And so now my own son, my own child, had suffered in this way and been ripped away from his life, his opportunities in this world. I knew I wouldn't, see him, the light in his eyes when he found the love of his life. I wouldn't be at his wedding. I wouldn't, see him holding his first child, playing with his kids, and it's been devastating. And when I used to wonder, do I just believe in God because terrible things haven't happened to me and to my children? Right? And now I know the answer to that question. And I wish I didn't. But don't get me wrong, there's greater suffering here than I knew I was capable of every day. But when I found out news about Donnie's death, I I screamed and screamed. And while I was screaming, I heard something deep, deep inside of me. I heard my own voice saying to God, I trust you, God. And I don't even know how that's, to be honest, I don't even know how that's possible. I don't know where that's coming from. And it's not like I haven't been angry with God at times, right, and baffled, and this is the greatest emotional and spiritual struggle of my life, and will continue to be. But when push comes to shove, I have brightness of hope, right? I will see Donnie again. I will see my two sons, laughing together the way that they did, that they have always in the past. And, we are family, and that will continue. And that is because of Jesus Christ, right? And Donnie kept a gratitude journal sometimes, and just a few months before he died, he wrote about how grateful he was that Jesus suffered, shared his sufferings, and suffered for him. And whatever else there is, the Book of Mormon on its title page says part of its message, Jesus is the Christ, the eternal God, right? And it talks about, Abinadi says, and King Benjamin says, God himself will come down and bear our burdens, take upon him our burdens. And so that's God revealing himself to us in Christ and taking our sufferings upon him. And so God in Christ suffers with us. And so we did not suffer alone. I did not suffer alone. Donnie did not suffer alone. We don't know all of the big picture of things, right? But we have hope. The gospel of Jesus Christ provides hope for the future. And when you listen to the voices of, that try to tear down the gospel, what do they have to offer? What are they offering, right? That your life is meaningless, or you just kind of choose your own. It's like a choose your own adventure. You should sort of choose your own purposes, things that are meaningful to you, but they don't have some ultimate meaning. There isn't ultimate hope. And so what you can just sort of live in the expectation that ultimately everything that you care about is going to be destroyed. This is, what guidance do they give for life, for your children, for the raising of your children?
It's lacking
right?
depth. There is no depth.
Completely. Why do we have inside of us these desires for goodness, for truth, for meaning, if they don't point to something beyond us, right? Are we going to believe the testimony of our own nature, the testimony of who we are, or not?
I love that so much. I will ask questions. We're almost out of time here, but the question that I would typically ask is what advice would you have for somebody that's going through a faith crisis? But what I would love to hear from you is, what advice would you have for somebody that's going through a really hard, tragic loss or something in their life that feels disconnected from heaven?
Yeah. I'm figuring out answers to that more and more all the time. I would say quickly for people struggling with doubt, one thing that I would say is keep hold of the things that you do know are true. Keep hold. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Whatever has worked in your life, make sure you keep doing that. Don't let yourself become so focused on the things that you're struggling with or that are disturbing to you, that you stop doing those things, right? And those things can serve as an anchor. And like I was saying, there are things in us, like the things that are implanted in us, the spiritual depths, the moral depths, like those are another thing we can hold on to as a kind of witness toward God, right? They point us to him. And struggling with deep pain, I would say, for one thing, to recognize that, we're not alone in the pain that we have, definitely to turn outward. There's so much human goodness. It's not all goodness in the world, right? There are terrible things, but there's so much. I have experienced so much kindness and compassion from others. There are people who, people don't necessarily know that you need someone to lean on unless you talk to them, right? Communicate with them. And for me, something important has been just to let the feelings pass through me, to not try to put on a happy face, to not try to avoid the feelings. When the full weight of the grief that I have for Donnie comes, it goes through me like a cyclone full of razor blades over and over, and I just let it. I bawl, right? And it passes through, and another thing I would say that's helping me tremendously is just seek meaning. Right? Seek meaning, like what can you do? How can you use this experience to help others, to help your loved ones? In the case of Donnie, right? Donnie, I discovered he had a book of poetry on his computer that he was basically finished with. He was getting ready for publication, called Light of an Hour. Watch for it, because I'm going to get that thing published, right? So there are still things that I can do, all kinds of things I can do for him. There's meanings to be fulfilled.
I love that so much. Scott's giving me the look over there, so I guess that means it's time. But Dawn, thank you so much. I can never get enough of listening to your story and all of your insights. They are so faith promoting and just faith strengthening. And everybody here, go check out everything Dawn has done. It's just so fascinating, and I just appreciate you taking the time with me today.
Thank you, Ashly.
Thank you so much for being a supporter of the Comeback Podcast and listening to our episodes. It would mean so much to us if you would like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It helps other people be able to find us, and we want to share this message to everyone.